This is a Sports Catastrophe production.
Hey there, Heather Ho, there's Jeff Cutastrophe welcoming to another Sports Catastrophe on this day. And you're surprised that I am doing it on this day. But yep, I found it on this day. So anyway, on this day, May 6, 1997, the Hartford Whalers, the logo you see if you're watching it on video, turned into the Carolina Hurricanes. Yes, it was official. Everyone knew that Hartford was going to move because Hartford had an emotional send-off in 97, but it was officially confirmed they were going to be in Carolina. They could have easily of not moved and all that. So anyway, this is a shot. This was the big shot because that was the third former WHA team to move house after the Jets moved to Phoenix and the Nordiques moved to Colorado. So the WHA franchises were not looking good, and there were rumors that Edmonton was going to move to either Nashville or Houston for a little bit. Thankfully, though, they stayed in Edmonton. So anyway, the Hartford Whalers are an interesting franchise and all that. They played in the WHA, the World Hockey Association, which was supposed to challenge the NHL for supremacy in the 70s, which kind of did. And so Boston would get a team. They decided to become the New England Whalers because they were trying to represent a geographical area. There were a lot of American players playing for the Whalers, so New England made their moves. They would sign players like Ted Green, Rick Lay, Brad Selwood, and Al Smith away from the NHL. And there were a lot of Americans: Larry Plow, Kevin Ahern, and John Cuniff, to say the least. Tommy Williams also played. Yeah, they're all Americans. New England would actually become the first WHA champions, beating Winnipeg. They had to move. Well, the first season they played games between Boston Garden and Boston Arena. Boston Arena was too small to sustain the WHA team, and the Garden was owned by the Bruins. And they would have bad priority dates. You got the Bruins, the Celtics, and even the AHL's Boston team gave them better things. So anyway, Hartford would actually open a new modern downtown arena and convention center, the Hartford Civic Center, within a mall. Hartford wanted an ABA team, like an American Basketball Association team, but then, they wanted hockey. So anyway, the Whalers would play the first part of the 74-75 season in West Springfield, Massachusetts. And then they would play at the Hartford Civic Center. They actually had to move for a little bit to the Springfield Civic Center because the Hartford Civic Center had to be rebuilt because heavy snow followed by heavy rain caused the roof, and a lot of shortcomings collapsed. New England would only win one WHA champion. That was 73. But never missed the playoffs. So that was huge. And they also signed Gordie Howe alongside his sons Mark and Marty from Houston in 1977. Houston was about to collapse. It was amazing and all that. The Whalers would be admitted to the NHL as part of one of the 4 WHA teams to move up. The Whalers were not really stripped of their roster like the other teams, like the Oilers, Jets, and the Nordiques. But regardless, they became the Hartford Whalers because you don't want a geographical spot and all that. So anyway, the House could have moved to Detroit. Detroit could have re-signed Gordie because they had essential rights, but decided not to. So anyway, it was huge and all that. Well, New England became the Hartford Whalers because Boston did not want the team named New England. Fair enough. Peter Good, who recently passed away, was hired to design a new logo for the team because of the whole New England Whalers thing with the W, but then there was a harpoon, so they had to get rid of the harpoon. But Peter Good did good. He put a whale's tail over a W, allowing the negative space between the two shapes to create an H. So yeah, teams because of green and blue. It was kind of funny, whale, and then you had an H in the middle and a W. Looked like a unibrow. But anyway, the Whalers were not as successful though. They would only have 3 winning seasons in their 18 years in Hartford. Went to the playoffs 8 times because of the formats that in the divisional round, the top 4 out of 5 teams made the playoffs and only won 1 playoff series. That was 1986, but that was a shocker because Hartford shocked Quebec, who won the division in 86. But Hartford shocked everyone. Until 2002, that was the only time the Whalers/Canes won a playoff series. The Whalers would, of course, have the rivalry with the Bruins because they were only 100 miles apart and all that. Bruins Whalers games really had the crowds. Like, Boston's home crowds would be packed with Whaler fans and vice versa. Hartford was the smallest American market in the NHL and was on the dividing line between the home territories for Boston and New York area teams. The marketability just didn't work. The Civic Center, at its maximum, could only seat 15,000 people, and it was in a mall, too. Anyway, the Whalers actually made the playoffs in their first year. They were led by Mike Rogers, Blaine Stoughton, Dave Keon, Mark Howe, Gordie Howe, Rick Lay, and Andre Lacroix. The Whalers actually picked up Bobby Hull in 1980 after he had a falling out with the Jets. They actually had the most points of any of the 4 WHA teams. And all that. Unfortunately, Hartford would be swept 3-0. Gordie Howe did score a famous goal in Game 2, but that was it. Yvon Lambert scored another overtime goal for Montreal to beat Hartford in that series. So no Howe or Lacroix ever again. Hartford tried his best. All that. They did everything. All that. It was a shock. Oh yeah, when Hartford swept Quebec, they actually forced a Game 7 against the Habitants. It was shocking that Hartford pushed it to Game 7. Unfortunately, they lose in overtime and Claude Lemieux's double overtime goal. Montreal would then go on to win the Stanley Cup. And Hartford won their division in 87. And it looked pretty good. But Quebec returned the favor to Hartford in the first round. The Whalers did pretty well winning the first 2 games, but then lost the next 4. Losing the series 4-2. So yeah, Quebec got Hartford back for what Hartford did to them the previous year. It was a close game and all of that. Hartford actually had a 2-1 lead on the Bruins in the 1990 playoffs and were inches away, a period away from winning Game 4, making it 3-1. Unfortunately, Bruins would score 4 goals in the third period to win the game 6-5, and Hartford did not recover as they lost Game 7. Boston then went on to win the trip to the Stanley Cup, losing to the Oilers. Hartford would make a massive trade with the Penguins in 1991 at the trade deadline, trading their heart and soul Ron Francis alongside Ulf Samuelsson and Grant Jennings for John Cullen, Sarli Slavsky, and Jeff Parker. A lot of people said that, Hartford traded their heart and soul because they were like rebuilding, I guess. The bad news was that Jeff Parker actually got hurt 4 games into his Hartford career, which basically ended his career. And the trade was more painful when Ron Francis and Ulf Samuelsson were part of the Penguins teams of the 90s. Early 90s that looked pretty good, winning a couple cups. All that. It was just disastrous and all that. Hartford did get to the 92 playoffs and took on Montreal in a classic first round series that had to go to double overtime in Game 7 to be resolved. Unfortunately for Hartford, Russ Courtnall scored. And that would be the last time the Whalers would qualify in Hartford in the playoffs. So it was just awful and all of that. Hartford had some good movements and all that. After a trade with the Sharks, the Whalers' second overall pick was Chris Pronger. You may have heard of him. He was pretty good. Well, that Brian Burke would have a lot of issues with the team, and Paul Holmgren too. Pierre McGuire. Why would you want Pierre McGuire and all that? So anyway, the Whalers just had a lot of problems. They had new ownership. Unfortunately, for the 96-97 season, Peter Carmanos, even though that he had a pledge to keep Hartford in for a few more years, the city for a few years, actually decided to leave. And all that because they couldn't sell the season tickets they wanted to. And it also didn't help much that the Connecticut governor did not want to spend taxpayer dollars to fund a new arena in Hartford. There were rumors that they would even have moved the Whalers to Norfolk, Virginia. Anyway, the Whalers were not going to make the playoffs. They faced the Tampa Bay Lightning and won 2-1. Kevin Dineen scored the final goal in Whalers history. And it was said goodbye. And then the team now moved to Carolina. They would play at Greensboro Coliseum for a few years, home to North Carolina State, and then they would get to Raleigh, and the RBC Center, or whatever it's called now. So anyway, Hartford would not lose hockey for long, as Binghamton, the AHL affiliate of the New York Rangers, moved to Hartford, calling themselves the Hartford Wolfpack. So anyway, the last Hartford/Carolina player was Glenn Wesley, who played in 2008. Anyway. And the final former Whalers player in the AHL was J.S. Shiger, who retired after the 2014 season. But the Hurricanes would actually pay tribute many times to the Whalers and all that. And when Carolina did their reverse retros in 2021, they would wear silver versions of the classic Whalers uniform, which was pretty cool. And of course, let's not forget the famous song Brass Bonanza. Do 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 do. Well, Brian Burke actually said that the song was embarrassing players when he was GM. It replaced it with Goldhorn in the song Hot 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 by Buster Poindexter, and then a year later by Rock and Roll Part 2, Gary Glitter. But Brass Bonanza came back. Brass Bonanza! So that's a history of the Hartford Whalers when they were in Hartford before they moved to Carolina and won a Stanley Cup in 2006. It's stupid how Carolina's won a Stanley Cup since the 2000s and the Leafs haven't. Pisses me off, especially 2002. Anyway, I'm Jeff. I'm going to do.